Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Kohl. I'm the Senior Advisor in the ERE program and coordinator of this series. And our subject today, as advertised, is the resurgence of U.S. renewable energy, which we'll try to dissect and understand and maybe forecast a little bit. Great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lola Infante, who is a SAIS PhD and for almost 14 years has been working at the Edison Electric Institute, which is the, as most of you know, I think the trade association for U.S. investor-owned utilities. She is their senior director for generation fuels and market analysis and has been focusing particularly on solar energy, energy storage, and distributed energy resources of various kinds, and I understand spends a fair amount of time traveling around the country, keeping up with what's going on in various places. She's a frequent speaker on these issues and has also authored a number of papers and articles. Before joining EEI, she worked for a think tank here in Washington known as Center for the Advancement of Energy Markets, and another firm in Paris, France. She actually has a BA degree from Sciences Po in Paris and an MA in International Economics and Finance, also in Paris at the Sorbonne, before she came to SAIS and received her MA and then her PhD. So Lola, we welcome you very much.
So yeah, I did study in France, but I'm originally from Spain, actually, so it's a complicated world, a globalized world, I should say. So thank you for having me. It's actually so nice to be back after so many years. I haven't been at EI for 14 years, only almost 12. It's a lifetime. I was just telling Professor Banks before we began that I was going to be there for 3 to 5 years, and then one thing led to the next, and it's been almost 12. And I'm sure that if nothing comes along, it will be 25, and then I will retire from there, and I will have had one job in all my life. But hey, that's what it is. So a sign of our times, this is the third speech of my day, so this is why I'm drinking like nonstop, so don't worry if I'm like, get parched or lose my mind. Just another thing is, like, I understand we have a lot of time. I have at least 20 to 30 minutes, which is plenty to cover some of the things I want to discuss. But if there's any questions you have as I'm speaking, please do interrupt, raise your hands. I think we'll be a little bit more engaging again if you ask questions as we go. My title is 12 years old. So I really don't do generation markets and generation fuels and market analysis anymore, particularly because I'm spending a lot of my time on energy storage. As I don't know if you know this, but if you didn't, you need to know storage is not a generation source. Everybody will tell you that. It comes with great implications. We actually have the biggest expert on storage here. But we can introduce him later. So I'm going to go very quickly. The role today was to talk about the surge or resurgence of renewable energy in the U.S. I think it's good to put the topic in perspective, talk about what I think are the different waves of renewable development in the U.S., and then, of course, talk a little bit about the drivers and challenges of renewable deployment, what it really means. Cannot speak renewables without speaking storage, at least for 2 slides nowadays. And then we can discuss very briefly outlook and opportunities and see. And on that one, I will actually be very interested in knowing what you guys think about what the future is for that. So I like to start every conversation about our fleet and the way we generate electricity with this. I think it's important to understand a couple of things. One is that the electric power uses about 38% of the primary energy in the US. It is a big consumer of energy, but not the biggest, and not the only one. Another interesting point in particular is that oil is definitely not part of the conversation when it comes to electricity. We hear a lot of people, particularly at the Hill, still talking about oil markets and electricity and how we need domestic markets, and electricity is a domestic resource. It is produced with domestic resources between renewables and coal and natural gas, all those things are domestic. Oil is really not part of the equation anymore, except in Alaska and Hawaii, and things are changing there, and we can talk about it. Interesting case studies about the evolution of the electric power. Another interesting point is that renewable energy is, this is really small and a sign of our times. I can barely read the slide, the little numbers, but renewable energy is not only used by the electric power sector. That's, I think that number is 50-some%, almost 60. But there's a lot of renewables that are used elsewhere in the economy, and again, that's not what we want to talk about, but it's good to keep in mind that there's a context to this both the electric sector and the different fuels. So another thing that I think is very important to keep in mind as we talk about anything that has to do with electricity and the technologies is that no two states are the same, and the way that the country generates electricity is completely different from one region to the next. Those variations come because of historical reasons, because of policy, because of natural resource endowment, because the customers of the utilities are different, because they want different things, because some states are richer than others. Just as an example, Montana, Minnesota, for instance, they have a tremendous industrial base. So most of the electricity goes to industrial customers. Those folks, what they really want is reliable, cost-effective electricity. So they really don't care much whether that electricity is super clean, a little clean, kind of clean, super clean, right? They want reliable and affordable. That has nothing to do with what customers want in California, where they really want, they're willing to pay a little bit more, but that electricity has to be greener and more sustainable overall and fit their lifestyle a little bit better. And again, all the regions are a little different, and we can talk about that later if you want, but why those differences come and happen is, again, there's many, many factors that go into that. At the national level, I think it is undeniable that the way that electricity is made in the US has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And I mean dramatically. When I first started doing this job, electricity was still produced 50% by coal, about 20% by nukes, 20-some% by gas. Renewables worth 0.5% of the equation, non-hydro, right? 10, 12 years later, you can see in that graph, gas produces more electricity than coal in most parts of the country and at the national level. That trend is likely to continue. It's not the same in other parts of the world. The trends and the whys and why nots of that are different than in other parts of the world. But it is very significant, maybe a topic for another conversation. But another important piece is that renewables are taking a bigger chunk of the generation mix, right? It's very, very clear, again, since I started running these numbers and looking at the industry, wind in particular, but not only, they've been growing like 0.5% every year, and 0.5 plus 0.5 plus 0.5, it's grown quite dramatically. So dramatically that I think it's very interesting, important to realize that about a third of the US generation, electric generation, is produced with zero emission sources. Nuclear and hydro and non-hydro renewables. That is something that people sometimes forget when we talk about how dirty the United States electricity production is because it's all coal. It's not true anymore. Used to be, it is definitely not true. I checked the numbers before coming here, and the first 6 months of the year, between January and June, that 30-some% is closer to 40. The year could end differently, right? The winter, if it's really cold, we will run more of our coal plants and all those things. But I think what is interesting to note is that it is a trend that it is continuing. The fleet is getting, our generation is getting cleaner and cleaner because there's more and more renewables. And of course, there's, those that almost 20% of nuclear makes a difference. But it's something that it's important. Out of the other 2/3, a third is natural gas, or more than a third is natural gas. So if you look at that with the environment in mind, a third is zero emitting, a third is low emitting, and a third and less and declining is your full emitting, I should say. Cool. So it's interesting. This is just a note, kind of like, I don't know how familiar you are with the terminology in the electric sector, but generation and capacitor are completely different things. So sometimes people mix them. They don't really understand that you need X megawatts to generate X megawatt hours. So this is just to show you when you hear megawatts or investment or dollars, it's not the actual production. And if you see a pie that shows that gas is the majority of the fleet, that means the capacity that is there, the power plants that are installed on the ground to generate something. So I'm sure you all know that not all technologies produce the same amount of power with the same amount of capacity, right? So that's also something that we need to see here. To generate the same amount of electricity, you're going to need a lot more renewables, for instance, than you need nuclear, because the nuclear runs all the time, renewables don't, that type of thing. Anyway, we don't have time. So specifically on renewable deployment, water. Any questions in general? No? Good. Another interesting historical tidbit that I like is that what is happening now about how we talk about changing the electric power sector, it is true, but it's not the only time that things have changed, right? Since then, data, I couldn't find data that goes before Second World War, but the way we generate electricity in this country has changed dramatically, right? We've had phases, and policy drives most of that. So I think we are in that world in which renewables, at least non-hydro renewables, are really coming in, and I think we can start saying, we're still, I think, there's a little, I don't know, we're still here, right? 2017, we're like still over here, not there. And even if this forecast by the Energy Information Administration comes through, it will still not be as, large as many would want, but the EIA is often very wrong. But anyway, I think the important thing is that there's been waves of change, and the technologies change, and the market changes, and now it's just one of those times. There could be a new technology that comes along, or a new policy, or a new goal that changes these things. Another thing that I think is very interesting to remember or to note, and this is what I will go back to my waves of renewable deployment, is that it's not a California phenomenon, right? It's not a California phenomenon, it's not a Texas phenomenon, it's not a New York phenomenon, it's a nationwide phenomenon. And the other thing that I find fascinating, it's, again, these waves. First, we had hydro. Then we had wind. That really started in the mid-2000s. This is fairly new as a technology that is fully, really deployed by the market. We have had wind and renewable technologies for a very long time, but when it really became commercial, and when utilities really started doing this, it's 10 years ago. It's not that long ago. And it really started on the plains, where most of the resources are, and that's where you see all of those big green dots. Those are big wind farms. Then you had a second wave, which it's even newer, 5-6 years, which is the solar wave. And that started in California for the most part, and the Southwest, where the most sun is. And that first wave had a lot of concentrated solar power, those big mirror type solar power plants that were followed by big photovoltaics, PV power plants, but again in the same regions. The third wave is the one that I understand is what you're most interested in, like most of the country and public opinion in general, is distributed generation. I would call that to be the third wave of renewable deployment, and that is even newer. I would say that's last 2, 3, 4 years essentially, and we're in the middle of it. I don't think we're in the middle of it. And that's where you start seeing a lot of little yellow dots on my map, and that's where solar started growing, not just in California and the sunny Southwest, but in the Carolinas, in New York, in New Jersey, in places where one wouldn't think that there's a lot of solar, and yet that's where most or a lot of the solar development is happening. If any of you has a project that needs ideas for, I think a good regression analysis to know whether wind is being driven by resources and solar by policy might make sense. Maybe not just yet, because time, might have something to do there, like, nascent industry or not. But I think this map shows definitely that. It shows most of the wind when the wind is and most of the solar where the policy is. So again, I'm not saying that this map is going to be like this in 10 years, but right now that's what it looks like. So anyway, that's an interesting point. Another point about solar in general, it is, I mean, I think I want to get to that in a little bit, but even though it's taking the lion's share of media and attention, it's still the least deployed renewable, let's put it that way. So back to this, this is why renewables is growing and this is why gas is, well, maybe not so, but this is why renewables is growing and this is relatively a new era since, as you can see here, 2005, 2006, 2007, that's where wind in particular starts being deployed in the US. This is a 10-year thing. It's very, very new. We've come a very long way in such a short period of time. I think that's something that people don't quite fathom or don't quite understand the significance of that. Within that big number on renewables, again, my point, wind is really the technology that is driving or that has driven renewable deployment up until now. We have the most of wind, it has the highest capacity factor, the costs have come down so radically that it actually starts making commercial sense, or it actually makes a lot of commercial sense. 3 years ago, solar was 0.some%. And I remember a talk at one of these gatherings that I say, you know, well, it's 0.001%, but 0.001% times 200% eventually will stop being 0% because it's growing that rapidly. It eventually was not 0% anymore, and it got to be 1.3%. I think estimates for this year make it closer to 2. The growth of solar power is staggering. This is not distributed solar. Again, I will tell you when I'm giving you numbers or data for distributed, utility scale, or both. This is utility scale solar, no distributed, no Walmarts and no residential solar. Only utility scale solar. The growth is phenomenal and it's supposed to continue. But again, you see the waves again. You see how biomass and geothermal stay very constant throughout. They were there forever. There's nothing new that is happening in those markets. Wind starts in the early 2000s and then solar starts kicking in only a couple years ago. Question? Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry. So there is, other than the technology where there's PV and concentrated solar power, which are just different technologies, one still has a boiler. The other one is essentially just converts the sunlight into electricity. Then you're really talking about the segments, right? Where the technology is being deployed. And I think that's the interesting thing about solar that brought a new thinking, a new given into the whole conversation. So there is utility scale solar, which is the large power plants that are integrated at the transmission level, just like any coal power plant or nuclear power plants or big natural gas power plants. They're owned and operated for the most part by utilities or by big independent power producers that sell the power to the utilities. Because of the type of technology, photovoltaics can be deployed at much smaller scales at the distribution level, distribution system, which we call actually behind the meter or front of the meter, right? So even then, there's those two parts. So there's the residential customers that can put the PVs on the roofs. So that's one of those residential segments, the distributed generation. And then also the distributed generation level, we have those commercial applications, which can be rooftop, can be ground mounted, and that would be more like the IKEAs and the Walmarts of the world that deploy storage on their premises. They're not getting the electricity from the grid, from the energy grid, but they produce it for themselves. So there's those 2/3 types of segments in which solar can be deployed. Wind too, for that matter. It just doesn't happen as often because, who's going to have a big wind tower turbine in their backyard? But it could happen. Geothermal, many people are doing geothermal in their homes. Anyway, there's different things, but helps. Good. So what drives, and I think we're running out of time here. I want to leave a lot of time for conversation, but again, wind has been, I don't know, again, the numbers might not give you any sense, but 10,000 megawatts of wind installed per year, it's a whole lot of new capacity. That is, the whole system, I think it's, I'm going to say something completely stupid, but let's say 1,200 gigawatts. So that is 12, so that 10%, I mean, that is, or 1%, I'm sorry, that is enormous amounts of power potential. The evolution, you're going to see, for instance, a year like 2013, there wasn't much. 2010, it looks like it goes up and down. Many people say that's because of the production tax credit, the financial incentives. We're going to talk about that in a couple of slides. It is because of that, but not because they expire, hence they don't have any more incentive to build. It's because they were going to expire and they didn't, so people front-loaded those projects. So the year before, they built more than they would have had it been more. So it didn't really constrain the overall build-out, but it did skew a little bit when you build one year and another one, right? If you run like a regression line, you'll see that it's, you know, it's a fairly constant line of build-out and capacity additions. I think I checked before, I think in 2017, whatever that amount is, almost 8,000 megawatts, that corresponds to about $11 billion in investment. It's a lot of money in this market. That's why a lot of people are interested, even though it's not as exciting as it used to be. Capacity factors are improving tremendously. They've gone from 20, 30% to 40 and more. That is a very acceptable capacity factor for renewable technology. Those machines are incredible. Some of the newer ones have a little bit of storage in them. I mean, they are pretty incredible. They're very nice things. And we're seeing PPAs, power purchase agreements, so the power that utilities buy the power from wind at 2-3 cents, sometimes lower than that. That is completely cost effective. People are developing wind not only because they have a mandate and they have to, but because it makes economic sense. That is exactly where we want renewables to be, in that sweet spot where it makes sense to develop them on economic basis alone. Solar is a little bit different, and this you'll see the three segments that the question before referred to: residential, non-residential, and utility. Most of what is being put on the ground is, again, at that utility scale level, larger power plants. Residential is growing very rapidly, and there's a lot of it, but it's still not the biggest driver of what's going on. And then commercial, non-residential here refers to commercial, industrial, and those others that are really utility, but they're at the distribution level, complicated. Anyway, so the things here, I think it's, again, I think the interesting thing is that it's growing very rapidly. The rates of growth are really phenomenal, and that it's mostly utilities driving the growth. All forecasts show that residential and non-residential are going to keep growing at a much faster rate. So we'll see how that happens. Those are really driven by policy, not necessarily economics, and hopefully we'll talk about that in a little bit. But again, we'll see how policy follows or doesn't, or public acceptance follows or doesn't. What's in the pipeline, it's the same thing. Those numbers are very big. Utility capacity factors of solar power compared to the 40-some% of the newer wind are very low. They're in the very low 20s, even teens. So some of these technologies, they're affordable. It doesn't mean that they make sense economically. You can afford them, you can buy them because they're not that expensive, but you might not be getting a lot for your money. So, I mean, cost effectiveness and affordability are completely different things, and I think solar is in that world where you don't always know necessarily where it is, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, but topic for another conversation. The conversation, and this is maybe the fourth wave, right, of renewable deployment. The conversation has changed dramatically in the past 10 years. It's gone from wind and RPSs and high voltage transmission lines that were going to take the wind from the plains to the coast, to solar and distributed generation. Now we're talking electrification, we're talking cybersecurity, we're talking microgrids. We're using words like resilience instead of reliability, rate design instead of cost. We're changing the conversation altogether. And I think that it's not only because of solar and distributed generation, but that's definitely what I think has brought about this change. The electric sector is definitely changing, not only integrating more renewables, but doing a lot of other things in the process, trying to integrate everything together. So I think this is important. I think this is probably one of the most exciting things that are happening right now. I know my job is, after 12 years in the same company, this is what's making it fun, that I get to change topics every 3 or 4 years. So I don't work on Mondays for wind anymore. I do smart cities and microgrids and things like that. So this is my pitch. Think about a career in the electric power sector. It is absolutely fascinating, in DC in particular, but anywhere in the country. But again, the conversations are changing, and I think the vocabulary has changed, the goals have changed, the way we look, or the industry looks at things, have changed. Everything has to be done through the lens of the customer, right? And what the customer wants. And that is not different than from happening in other industries like telecom and computer electronics, that type of thing. It's the customer is king. The customer has found ways to empower him, herself, and really demand things from their providers that didn't exist before. And that has changed the way we look at renewable energy, I think, in general, and other technologies as well. So very briefly, I don't know how much time I've got, 5-10 minutes. I'll get it done. So some of the drivers, or the more important ones, I think they're the obvious ones, right? Like technology, markets, policy, and as I was saying, customers and how they are moving or asking things. It's really transforming the industry. I'm not going to talk about natural gas, but what has happened with natural gas has had an impact on the fleet, the generation industry overall, but also on renewables. It has created easier way to integrate variable resources, but at the same time, natural gas prices are so low that it's very, very difficult to compete with it. And don't forget that this is an industry where making money still is, this is, for the most part, private companies that have shareholders. They're for-profit companies. So making money is important. And then there's the rate. So increasing cost unnecessarily, it's not exactly what regulators will allow. So having cost-effective, not just affordable, but cost-effective technologies being used is actually quite important. Environmental regulations, obviously, EPA, we're not going to talk about the EPA today, or not in the next 3 years anyway. Maybe not ever. Technology cost, nothing could have happened if the cost of these technologies hadn't gone down. It's clear. Diversification has always been critical for the industry. It continues to be so. Again, reliability issues are paramount. Public policies, we'll talk about that, obviously. Financial incentives, we'll talk about that, obviously. Customer demand is what I was telling you about before. More and more people are demanding greener, more sustainable technologies, greener, more sustainable power. So cost is obviously a powerful driver in any kind of technology adoption. No one wants to pay some, except for cell phones. I hear the latest iPhone is $1,000 or something like that. Anyway, costs have gone down dramatically. I think it's important to realize that, but again, I go back to my point before, affordability is not cost effectiveness. Except when we compare and we realize that in some circumstances it really is. This is unsubsidized, levelized cost of electricity, of energy, from several, I don't know where you can see it, but at the very bottom you have natural gas combined cycle, which up until recently was the cheapest form to generate electricity. On the blues is more of the conventional technologies. On the greens, it's the alternative energy technologies. Starting at the top with solar rooftop, as you can see, it's incredibly expensive. And at the very bottom, it's wind, which is pretty competitive compared to the gas combined cycle. And again, this is unsubsidized. Once you add the subsidies that the federal government provides, or the states, of which there are quite a few, then these resources really it makes sense for utilities and other companies to really build some of these green technologies. I think that is, when we look forward to the future of renewable energy, and I think this is what we need to look at. This is how it's going to stay in the mix. Very specifically, wind PPAs, again, the price, not just the theoretical price of a technology calculated by Lazard up in New York City, but very specifically the contracts that utilities are paying these developers for their power. We're seeing wind at 2 cents the kilowatt hour. That is, I can't even give you a comparison. That is very low. It makes more sense to buy wind than to buy something else. This is, again, it makes sense, and not just in Texas. It makes sense in other parts of the country. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you know if BNL's analysis there includes subsidies? Is that
That one is yeah, it does. It's the power, it's the contract terms, so it does include subsidies, which is, they will sell wind at zero. As long as they're able to produce and sell it, they get the 2 cents from the PTC. That's why they're selling at 2. So if they sell it, they're actually getting 4. But essentially, yeah, it does. But it is what it is. It's still. We'll talk about the PTC. It's only for 10 years. This is the market price of wind. This is the market price of solar. Still not as cheap, still not necessarily competitive in all parts of the country with other alternative technologies, but definitely getting there in some areas. In the Southwest, it makes sense. We're definitely getting there. I think those are very encouraging developments. We saw some bids recently, I think solar plus storage at 2.5 cents in Colorado, of all places. This is tremendous change. Just the point, because I am who I am and I don't need to pontificate, but residential solar is about twice as expensive as utility scale solar. So if you really care about the environment, don't put a roof on your house. Or if you do it, but you need to know that you're not saving the environment and you're not saving yourself any money. But do it because of other reasons, right? If you really want to save the environment, let's do more large-scale things that actually cost less. That's just, I had to do that. And this is just to reinforce my point. The same folks up in New York at Lazard calculated the cost of carbon abatement. Utility-scale solar and wind are the two technologies that really get you there in a cost-effective way. Distributed solar doesn't. It's sexy, it's fun, you can do it, you can afford it, but it does not get you there. With that, move on to state policy. The second most important, was there a question or laughter? The second more important, is not that it's second if importance. Another very important driver of renewables has obviously been the renewable portfolio standards and the mandates where, again, I'm running out of time, but states forced utilities to procure a certain amount of renewables. And that has been a very powerful tool. As a point of anecdote, at least for wind, we're building more wind, or the country is building more wind than the mandates ask for. So we don't need them anymore when it comes to that. They're irrelevant when it comes to that at this point, at least for wind. Because solar is a little different than wind, many states decided to add special carve-outs for the RPSs. Again, my economics background doesn't let me like something like that. Specific carve-outs for non-cost-effective technologies. I would have preferred mandates for environmental goals rather than technology goals, but that's the way the United States has gone about it, different in Europe. Topic for a different conversation as well. So many states have carve-outs for solar in particular within the renewable portfolio standards, right? That has had an impact, but probably not as much as other state policies like net metering and other type of policies at the state level. Federal incentives, and this is what we're talking about a little bit before, the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, the two, I'm assuming you're aware of both. Wind traditionally uses the production tax credit, and solar, the investment tax credit. It has to do with the ratio of what costs more and it's easier to sell essentially, so what costs less and produces more. So wind is, the PTC favors wind, and the ITC is easier for solar. Both were about to expire. They were many times. They were extended many times. The last one is, we'll see what happens. The last revision, I think it was 2015, put both incentives on a downward path towards extinction, more or less, so they're both are going to be phased out and expire. The PTC will expire in 2019, so starting in 2020 there will be no more PTC, and it will just be a little bit less money every year between now and then. And the ITC, there's two investment tax credits, one for businesses, another one for residential. The one for businesses is 30%, and it does not expire, so it will just phase down to 10%. And it will stay at 10% forever. The residential one is now at 30%, and it will be phased down to zero until, when 2022, whenever that date is. I can't imagine the solar industry not fighting for getting at least the same terms for residential than they have for businesses, but you never know. Again, the political environment has changed radically in the last few months in DC. The other driver that is, we cannot talk about any changes in any industry nowadays, definitely not the energy industry, is the customer. Is it a new type of customer? I don't know. But all of these folks and many more have sustainability goals. They have on-site generation and/or buy green power from their utilities or directly from wind or solar producers. This is a very powerful driver when folks go to their utility and they say, I want more green. The utilities are beginning to listen and do it. Not anymore. The residentials they're not speaking directly. They usually don't have as big a voice because, one of you is not as big as one of IKEA. But who I think the residential customers are, who is trying to channel residential customers are the solar developers like the now defunct Solar City or Tesla, Sunrun, the actual residential solar developers. They're not always, they care about themselves, not necessarily you, but they are carrying that voice. And they're very powerful. As in incredibly powerful. There's other associations, consumer advocates that have joined into the conversations, but that too. The interesting thing about customers is that they might not ask for a greener, but when offered, they take advantage of it. So it's a different type of voice. They're not, you can't go to Pepco, I don't know where you live, for Dominion and say, I want more of this, but you can sign to their programs, and they do listen to that. And you can sign to their energy efficiency demand response programs, and you can feel more empowered, and then you can call them and say, how can I save money? And all those little things, they start adding up, 1 + 1 = a million, and they do listen. So the residential customers, they start, they have a voice, a very powerful one. Obviously these guys are, they are able to negotiate their different individual rates. So but no, I think a lot of what's happening is done for residential customers. Utilities also need residential customers to be able to meet some of their goals, to shave peak, to be more energy efficient at 3 PM, that type of thing. So there's a much better communication and dialectical dialogue. That didn't mean anything, but you know what I meant. So the industry, not only the utilities, but all parties are really addressing some of the challenges that remain. And I'm going to go really quickly here. Some of the technical challenges, they still are there. The variability of the grid has increased. It's not insurmountable. Engineers will fix all of these things. It's just a matter of adding money to the, investing in the right technologies and ways in which this can be managed. But it is a problem, but it is being addressed, but it does exist. With distributed generation, we've got a two-way power flow instead of just the one. It's the same thing. It can be fixed. It just requires more investment and more planning and better integration of all the decision points within the industry, which is not only the utility, it also includes now all those third parties that are trying to plug into the system. So better integration, better collaboration, better planning among all of those will get there. But again, it is a challenge that has to be addressed. Not the end of the world, but it has to happen. Market challenges, I discuss low gas prices. It can be a blessing and a curse. When it comes to renewable development, it's not good. The gas prices are this low. They're just not competitive. And as I was saying before, utilities don't decide in a vacuum. Regulators tell them what they can and cannot do. And regulators, they will not approve of investments if there's a cheaper, better fit alternative. That's just it's their mandate. That's the way it goes. So never think of a utility not doing something because they don't want to. There's always a regulator behind putting constraints and parameters around what they can and cannot do. Curtailment, negative pricing during times of low demand. We talked about that a little bit. Negative pricing, as long as they produce, they get money because of the PTC. That means that maybe a nuclear plant needs to shut down. Well, that is not really an option. So the nuclear plant actually ends up paying money to the wind for the wind not to produce. That is not the most efficient outcome in a market. Again, not insurmountable, but market rules need to change. I need to adapt to include and integrate all these resources. It's not as easy as just plugging something into the grid and wanting it to happen. Many things on the periphery need to happen for it to happen properly and in a sustainable manner. And then obviously regulatory challenges, that's where most of my time and many of my colleagues' time goes, is in changing business models, regulatory structures, and things of that nature that actually also need to change in order for all this to fit together in a way that makes sense for the industry, for customers, and for all industry and customers. I guess that's all there is, and other third parties. That was an illustration of the integration challenges, illustration of the transition, illustration of rate reform, illustration of how important these issues are. In 2017, all of these states, and probably we forgot the 5 that are not in there, we missed something, discuss at some level distributed solar and or net metering. And I'm not even talking about other renewable issues. I'm assuming that the 5 states that are missing here discuss renewable distributed generation grid modeling at some level. These are not conversations happening in DC. These are conversations happening everywhere in the country. Another word that is coming up that we cannot talk about, it's not just a renewables thing, it's more of a smart thing, distributed generation thing. The smarter things we get, which are needed to properly integrate distributed resources, the more cyber issues we get. This is another one of those words that are coming up more and more. Cyber and physical threats, resilience are words that did not really exist in the industry vocabulary, really. It was, they were there, but there was nothing to do with it. Data access, all these things are becoming more and more important. As in tremendously, critically important. Without, just an example, without proper communication protocols that address cyber issues, there's not going to be a good inverter that really is able to communicate between the house and the utility, for instance. It's just not going to happen. So sometimes we need to get those very complicated things out of the way first before we can get more things done. Just an illustration of that type of thing that, it's not all fun. Some of these things are fun, but a lot more dry and complicated and more engineer type thing. They need to happen before. Can't talk about renewables without talking about storage. Mr. Imre Gyuk is right there. He is the director of the Energy Storage Program at DOE. Did I say it right? Yes. He runs a $20 million program. 40? Sorry, I cut you in half. 40 million. I was just in one of his meetings in Santa Fe last week. He's doing tremendous things to promote and advance energy storage. So if you have questions, ask him, not me. That's actually great to see him here. I'm not going to bore you with this. The future of renewables really does depend on what happens with energy storage, and not just renewables. Many of the things in the grid that we want happen, I'm assuming, will only happen if storage does happen. I'm spending, as I was saying before, about 80% of my time on storage issues now. So everybody loves storage. It's something that is different from distributed solar. When we started working about this on these issues, it wasn't the same way because it benefits everybody. It can be put on any part of the value chain and help operations. The one thing about storage, and correct me if I get it wrong, Imra, storage cannot really do anything that cannot be done with another technology, but it can do it better sometimes, can do it more efficiently sometimes. It has the potential of doing it better, more efficiently, and more cost effectively, and I think that's the important piece. But everybody wants to add storage. All stakeholders are looking into that. Storage is not only batteries. I'm completely out of time. It's a lot of other things, again, like in solar, electric utilities, or driving. It's a matter of sheer size, right? But they are driving the market. It's not Tesla, even though Tesla is doing a lot, just trying to put things in perspective. So batteries and thermal are, the biggest, largest growing segments on the energy storage world. As I was saying before, supposed to grow tremendously over the next few years. Cost, obviously, will drive that. Hopefully, DOE will get to their goal of, what was that, $100 per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour. That is a tremendous goal. If they achieve that, it will be phenomenal. Some of the issues that are happening on storage is, again, it goes back to the business models. How do we value and evaluate energy storage services? Conversation for another time, but these are things that are happening now that are very important. Policymakers are more and more interested in these issues. Again, what happened in 2018, and this is, I think, as of August, many states are dealing at some level with energy storage issues, the policymakers, regulators, and legislators in the states. This is not a theoretical something. This is happening now. Outlook and opportunities, again, the industry is changing. Some of the things that have driven the growth of renewables and distributed generation, they're not going to go anywhere. I think, again, the value focus, more dynamic, cleaner, all those things are there. And I think there's a couple of, if I find my notes here, a couple of additional points that are very important that I think make it that, again, these are technologies that not only they're not going to go anywhere, but I think they're here to stay. They're going to take an even larger role. One of them is greenhouse gas reduction goals from many of the utilities. I think I talked to one of my environmental friends a couple days ago, and he told me that, but utilities serving about 80% of customers, so pretty much all of the country, have short-term or long-term greenhouse reduction goals. That is tremendous progress. Another one goes back to customers. There's more and more companies that have sustainability goals, which means that the first thing they're going to do is look at their fleets and look at their electricity consumption and what they buy from their local utility. Talking about fleets, the third driver that I think can change and revolutionize all this is electrification. It's a little bit different in that it doesn't necessarily drive renewables, but when you couple greenhouse gas reduction goals plus sustainability goals plus electrification, I think that is a phenomenal combination for really reducing the emissions of the U.S. economy. So I think I have a few slides that I will skip gladly. Vision without execution is just hallucination, and I think that actually summarizes where we are on this very well. We need a little bit more vision and more collaboration, but I think we've proven that we can execute as a country as well and not just hallucinate about these things. These technologies are really happening, and I think it's exciting. It's a lot of things to work with. With that, I'm done. I talked like half an hour too long.
If you have more questions, please store them for a few minutes. And I've asked my colleague John Banks but why don't you talk here just to give a few comments. John is a visiting scholar at SAIS and is our local electrician, or rather electrical guru. He has done an amazing job in teaching a basic course called Global Electricity Markets and increased student demand tremendously, so he has to do this twice a year. And he's also thinking about other things we can do in that sector. John was a fellow at Brookings before he came to SAIS and has also worked for a number of years as a management consultant.
I will keep this very short, folks. I just wanted to frame a couple of points that Lola brought up and then maybe use my power as commenter to raise the first question. And I'm going to frame this, I think, from the interest of the students. So what I heard Lola say was that there's really sort of three major drivers or trends going on. One is in policy. Policy is driving decarbonization in the sector. The second is technology from the perspective of innovations in technology and also in cost declines in technology. And then third is the customer component, the sort of customerization, the customer engagement driver in the sector. And I think, and they're all mutually reinforcing as policy promotes lower carbon sources, it commercializes them, decreases their costs, becomes more attractive and affordable for customers, and then customers demand more. Customers are able to choose technologies and afford more technologies, both at the distributed as well as community solar and other pathways. What I thought would be interesting would be to see, and we teach students here to think about interconnections and how these themes are all interconnected. And I think it's really interesting to pick up on a few things here on the policy and the customer side. So for example, the federal-state intersection. Obviously, there is federal tax incentives, the PTC and the ITC, which Lola pointed out are being phased down in the next few years. What's going to happen to wind and solar? And you mentioned a little bit about your perspective on what might the impact be as those phase down. We're seeing a tremendous amount of activity at the state and local level, and I'm not talking about RPSs. You're probably all aware of California's SB 100, which is 100% clean energy, not renewable, but 100% clean energy by 2045. Massachusetts has 100% renewable energy by 2047. New York, 50% renewable by 2030. There are 10 U.S. cities who have established 100% renewable energy goals. So there's a significant amount of policy activity going on at the state level. And in addition, you mentioned the corporate customer driver, with more and more large customers approaching their utilities and demanding cleaner energy. And so these are really demonstrable, very aggressive targets at the local level. And I'd be curious to know, you posed a question, how are utilities viewing these and how are these trends going to evolve? And I think it would be interesting to get your perspective, personal or otherwise, on how utilities are managing this change. How do they look at 100% renewable targets in certain local jurisdictions and some of these more aggressive state-level targets? And the differences in how utilities address them. Obviously, the 50 states have 50 different targets. That poses a considerable challenge for investor-owned utilities. So I think it would be interesting to get some insight from you, Lola, on how you see policy evolving at the federal level, how you see utilities sort of viewing the aggressive targets at the state and local levels, and obviously some of those local targets are addressed by municipals or city-owned utilities, but obviously they also, many of them fall into the investor-owned utility territories, and how you see the trend evolving in customer demands, both at the corporate level and more at the residential level, and how are utilities sort of looking at what's going to happen going forward at the intersection of this federal-state dynamic with the state and local driver, this corporate driver. It seems like there's so much going on at this policy and customer intersection that I'm wondering if you could provide a little insight, again, personally or whether from the IOU perspective, as to how utilities are preparing themselves for this convergence of trends and these themes as they're evolving. How are they preparing and how are they responding? and maybe use that as a way to sort of get the conversation started, and then, of course, open the floor to any other questions or comments on that or any other trends.
So, is there any press in the room?
No press.
Are you sure? Anybody tweeting?
Oh, that's a good intro. Must be spicy.
No, it isn't, but I can be a little bit more candid if I trust that the audience is not going to repeat my words in public. When it comes to 100% renewables, that to me, that was part of like the RPS or mandate conversation, but you're right that it's a completely different trend that is being put forward in Hawaii by the state because they have obvious energy challenges there. In California, they're not quite, there, but yes, but customers at the local level, cities, municipalities are asking their utilities, give me 100% renewables. And it's not a secret, but that's what I don't want to get out. We have an initiative at EI about 100% renewables because it is that important. Utilities, a few months ago, they came to us and they said, how do we respond to this? And our first question was, what is the problem? And this is what they answer. I don't have a problem providing 100% renewables to Boulder or to Austin or to, I'm making up cities, or to, I don't know, Kansas City, Missouri. Or to Walmart and IKEA. I do have a problem providing 100% renewables to the whole wide system, to the Colorado system, to the Texas system. So the second challenge is, how do I convey that in a way that doesn't make me look like I'm a bad guy, that doesn't want to give customers what they want to get, and that doesn't make me look bad because I really love coal and I don't like wind and solar, which is never the case, by the way. So that initiative is twofold. One is the communications one, like a PR one. What are the words? How can we explain to the normal people that don't understand the electric system that you can't necessarily today, with the technology we have and at the cost that we can afford, get 100% renewables system-wide? How do we do that without looking like we don't want to do it? And at the same time, how to address the actual technical challenges when and if we can, so we slowly start getting there. So that's the answer. So yes, it's a huge issue. Two, it's so important that the utilities came to us. We have an initiative with those two pieces. So that's the way they have of addressing it. Really, truly looking into it and trying to meet the demands, but being realistic about what can and cannot be done. So I don't know how this is going to end, but I know that they're trying to make it happen. Again, probably we'll have to be working with the different stakeholders so everybody understands that it's going to have to be a phased-in process. In some systems, getting to 50, 60, 80. I don't think we can get to 100% within, my working life. But maybe, yes, we'll see.
And just
depends on Embry.
One quick follow-up to that. You can answer this from a personal perspective or otherwise, but do you see the trend moving toward more state and local policy?
I think
Pushing and
it's-
promoting rather than at the federal level, and just avoid thinking about the next 3 to 5 years, but just longer term.
I think it's
How do you see
undeniable.
policy evolving?
I think it's undeniable. I think we're getting to more of a local view of things. Again, I don't think it's just the current administration
Right.
engaging or not, but I think the trend is there as we get into, distributed by definition is local. Actually, the, generation options are by definition local. They're not federal, like the federal government doesn't get to decide on, there's state level issues. There's no interstate commerce, so the federal government doesn't get to opine. So the more important issues, they're all state issues and more local. So I think it's a no-brainer that we're definitely going to get into that more and more. Yeah.
Questions on the floor?
Yes, other questions if you could raise your hand, a microphone will come to you. And just introduce yourself briefly before asking a question.
Vid Vilcek, J-Power in Japan. Is there much international collaboration going on?
Not enough, I don't think. You raise an excellent point. We are looking, again, in my area, we're looking at a lot of what's happening in Europe, a lot of what's happening in Australia. There's an enormous amount of lessons learned, but I don't think there's enough. And part of that is that everybody is too proud to accept the lessons from other parts of the world. The Americans sometimes, utilities think that, but we're different. And the other way around, the Europeans sometimes look at the US utility, Europeans or Australians or others, they look at the US and they say, but we're so much more advanced, what could we learn from them? So I agree, I think there's not enough, actually, but there's some.
You read about GE's new wind turbine, wind
Is there a new one?
paper today?
I haven't
It's
seen
enormous.
it.
It's so big that it's overwhelming.
I believe you. The last one that won some type of award was so big that it was overwhelming already.
It's being made in France.
Of course. Since they don't do nuclear plants anymore, they do wind turbines. Hey.
I'm Bob Hershey, I'm a consultant. Could you tell us a little bit more about what's happening in storage?
Well, there's a lot happening in storage. I don't even know how to begin to answer that question. So storage a couple of years ago, maybe less, started being affordable. Again, back to my difference between affordable and cost effectiveness. Affordable enough that people as in utilities, third parties, developers, were able to build it, test it, use it, start showing the world that it actually makes sense. And very quickly, as in really quickly, we started seeing, not like a snowball, but almost, more and more utilities and others developing storage. This is batteries for the most part, right? Like pump hydro has existed forever, thermal has existed forever. So batteries, lithium ion, they just got effective. Everybody loves them. Everybody's trying to figure out how to make them work. There's some pressing issues, I think, that need to be solved before they can get to the next step, and you might not agree with me, but one of them is understanding what batteries can really, truly do. I don't know if you're aware, the Rocky Mountain Institute released a report a couple of years ago with the wheel, with all the use cases, all the potential applications of batteries. Many people think that one single battery can do everything at once, right? No, exactly. Policymakers and regulators look at that report and they have that impression. So they think this is the panacea that will solve everything at no cost at all. There's a lot of education that needs yet to happen from the industry to policymakers, but also within the industry. I don't think everybody really understands what those technologies can do yet. There's beginning to have enough information that we can put all that together, and I know DOE is working on that, EPRA is working on that. We are pushing all those folks that know what they're talking about to start putting some good information about that together. Another one is obviously cost, because the batteries can do many things at once. They should get multiple revenue streams, which would lower their overall cost or improve their cost effectiveness. That is something that policy-wise, regulatorily-wise, needs to be figured out. Again, there's a federal component, but also a state component, something also very important. Business models is incredibly important. And I don't know how I want to say this, because batteries or storage in general can help operations at the distribution, transmission, end use, generation, all parts of the grid. It can also be considered it can also act as a transformer, for instance, but can also act as a gas turbine. So some folks say, if it can be like a generation asset, let's have competition like in generating assets, right? Because it can happen. Some folks in the industry are saying, well, yeah, sure, but I don't have competition for transformers or transmission lines. So there is discussion about how we can and where within which segments allow competition under what mechanisms that can happen or not. So that's another competition, another issue, ownership and competition business models that is hot right now, that everybody's talking about. The valuation, I talked about it. How do you count storage? How do you evaluate? How do you give it a cost or a price in IRPs so it can compete with the other resources in the utility planning processes. We're at the very early stages, so there's a lot of things to figure out in terms of regulations, market rules, bigger policy issues, and just like understanding what the technologies can actually do. But I think the more there is, the more we'll get there. I think the one advantage about this as opposed to the technology is that literally everybody loves them. Republicans and Democrats and utilities and customers and Walmarts, everybody loves batteries in general, so I think that will be, that's good. But there's a lot happening. That's in too much.
Could I invite our DOE representative
Yes,
to
thank you.
maybe say a few words from
Yeah.
DOE's perspective on where we are and where we're going on storage?
Well, I agree with all of the above. No, but in particular, you have the question of 100% renewable. It's diminishing return. It's relatively easy to progress towards renewables, but as you go on, it gets more and more difficult. And it particularly gets more and more difficult because of this question of drawing on a resource. It's, it's almost like the rich and the poor. Well, the rich can afford to be renewable. The poor are not going to be able to afford to be renewable. It's the same with, organic food. We all love organic food, and some of us can to a considerable percentage eat organic food. But even then it's difficult to be 100%. Mm-hmm. But for a lot of people it's potatoes and tamales.
Yes.
So storage, yes indeed, everybody loves it. I thought it was just me, but it's been hard work. Mm-hmm. Because in the early days, everybody hated it. I can remember I gave a presentation in this very place at SAIS, and in the middle of my presentation, somebody from the wind industry stood up and said, I want it to be perfectly clear that wind does not need storage. Wind will back up wind. Now, the amusing thing was, in a way, was that at that very moment, there was a big outage due to a wind surge that had happened, and a considerable number of part of the transmission system was out on the East Coast. I mean, it was not a humongous outage, but it was there and it was caused by wind. So, wind needs storage just as much as anybody else. And yes, indeed, you can do a little bit geographic balancing and so on, but you're not going to balance the East Coast with the West Coast. And in any case, we only have 3 hours differential. So, that's not going to solve the wind problem. And it certainly won't solve the day-night problem with solar. Right. So wind is a buffer that can make a lot of things much more easy. And I pledge my best to reduce the cost of storage to the point where indeed things become cost effective. And we are beginning to have quite a number of applications where we can have payback of 6 years or perhaps less. So
It's great.
that counts,
It does.
and that'll do.
Yes, that will do.
Thank you. I think there were a few questions in the back that way.
Yeah.
Thank you. Enjoyed your presentation. Will your presentation be online?
Could you introduce
Oh,
yourself,
I'm so
please?
sorry. Mark Joyce. I just recently left US EPA after 30 years.
Sorry.
Started my own LLC. But again, will your presentation be online?
I don't know. I don't think I have a problem sharing it. I don't know if it will be online, or maybe we can,
Okay. Very good.
I can just share
just-
it.
Will, can we put it online?
Yeah,
Yeah, if we
Okay,
can post it.
Great, excellent, good.
in a day or two, we'll have it online.
Okay, thank you. Could you just say a bit about the subsidy that coal and nuclear continue to receive?
What subsidies are you referring to?
Well, extraction of coal on public lands, the discussion at FERC on mandating.
Yeah.
yes.
So those are like some of those sticky conversations that, from the EI's perspective, we have a stated policy that we would like all subsidies to disappear for all resources, so everybody can compete on equal footing on everything all the time. Some are easier to phase out and make expire than others, like the financial incentives, PTC and ITC, because they're, in time limited anyway. Some of those that are more ingrained in the tax code, they're more difficult. I think if we're serious about letting technologies compete, we need to look into all those things. I really don't know what's going to happen. I think some of those are so ingrained that we'll just have to live with them. I don't know that any administration will necessarily tackle those. FERCs or DOEs, I should say, look into, the reliability component of coal and nuclear. That is an awful complicated discussion. The industry was not pleased in general with that. That's all I can tell you about it. Many of the same reasons. The problem with that type of policy is that to better one, you make someone worse. So there's always going to be, if there's going to be a winner, there's definitely going to be a loser. So you don't have Pareto optimums on that. It's just not going to happen. So those are very tricky conversations in the industry. There's never agreement. So that's a half-baked answer, but there's really not much more. It looks like FERC will really not engage. So we'll see. We'll see what happens, but there's definitely not going to be industry consensus on any of that. It's too diverse. The industry is way, way diverse.
I think there was another hand there somewhere. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Marjorie. I'm a master's student here. Concentrating in energy resources and environment. I was really interested by the map that you showed of the development of wind versus solar, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that. Whether the solar industry was just better at lobbying, or why wind really didn't have the same sort of policy support.
That was a little bit of a joke, but yeah, I know what you mean. Okay. Sure. So, yeah, I was making a little bit of a joke, but it had a piece of truth, right? When you look at the green, you see that that's the wind. The wind is located where there's the most wind in the country, and the solar where the policies have been the most aggressive. And I think you can just look at the map and agree with that, right? I think the reason for that is the different stages in the development of the resource. I'm pretty sure that 10 years ago, this map showed a lot of wind in states with strong RPSs, and not so much in other parts. And as the technology evolves and matures, logically, it goes where the resources are. In the case of wind, you also see it in the map because, we blew up the bigger power plants, but there's a lot of little ones in other parts of the country, so I think that makes sense. In the case of solar, I'm hoping, but this is where I think the interesting exercise might be 5, 7, 10 years from now, if solar is all over the country or if it's really concentrated where it makes the most sense, then we will know whether it really followed the path of wind and follow where, of course, policy helps, but at the end of the day, what you really want is the technology to be cost effective. And when it comes to renewables, they will be more cost effective in the areas where there's more of that resource, right? So a rooftop solar cannot be, or a solar PV plant cannot be as cost-effective in New Jersey as it is in Arizona. That's just the way it is. So hopefully, eventually, we will see this map spread. As it is right now, it's very, very clear. You see the solar in California, Arizona. Surprisingly, in the last 18 months, the Carolinas, North Carolina in particular, which it didn't exist before, and then New Jersey, Massachusetts, a little bit in New York. But that is almost exclusively policy push, except actually in Carolinas it's too, it's the utility that has been driven that, no policy forcing them or pushing them in that direction. It's been almost exclusively utility-led. But again, I think it's just interesting to see that map. I was being a little facetious.
Hi, Julian Honey, Citizens Climate Lobby. You were talking a little bit about drivers, and obviously policy is a big driver. And so I guess I wanted to get your sort of insider scoop or read on carbon taxes, because some companies like BP have come out in support, which would seem counterintuitive. But I don't know your perspective on whether or not you think that would help a transition, or if that's even feasible, let alone this political climate, but just for a utility perspective.
Yeah, I don't think in this administration it's a conversation that is ever going to come up. Again, I'm not in the environmental department, so I don't know what the most in scoop on that front. In general, the Edison Electric Institute and all of its member companies, all the IOUs, I don't know if you remember, 2008, I think it was, Waxman Markey, the last attempt we had at a serious climate federal policy. We pushed for it. We lobbied hard for it. We created a framework that could work for coal and gas and all that, and it was taxes, maybe not so much because they have that connotation tax, but definitely cap and trade. It was something that the whole industry, and there was a lot of tension within the industry. A couple of companies left the association for a while and then came back. It was contentious, but we got to the point where all of the IOUs agreed on a federal policy on carbon tax. Most of them are not thrilled right now, and that's actually part of why a lot of the energy conversations are happening at the state level. It's because there's essentially a vacuum at the federal level. There was a clean power plan, then there isn't. What the industry wants is stability. Give me a policy, give me time, give me the means to achieve it, and that's fine. It's when things are either too quick or too unreasonable or changing constantly that the industry is not there. But the leadership in the electric utilities, investor-owned utilities at least, they're incredibly progressive that way, and they do have those greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, in part because there isn't a policy, but they still want to get there. So I think, we'll see. But at the federal level, I don't see it, not yet.
This gentleman down here in front.
Eric Oplerud from the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions. A lot of concern about fracking, natural gas pipelines going through all kinds of natural places, and a lot of building capacity of natural gas power plants. What do you see as the future of that as the environmental movement is creating a lot of static?
So I think there's two things there, right? Like the future of natural gas in general, and then the fracking, keep it in the ground movement. I think we need to be reasonable with whatever we want. So again, I think that goes back to my student times. Find policy goals and then adjust the tools to meet those goals. I think a lot of the policies that we're instituting on technologies or fuels, we're doing that independently of the goal. And I think as a nation in general, we need to be consistent with that. What do we want? I think we need to study the benefits or not, or dangers of fracking. I think that has been done. I think the gas industry has done a good job at figuring some of that out, or at least sharing information with the population in general. The pipelines and the keeping in the ground, first it was coal, we got rid of coal, now it's gas, we're gonna get rid of gas. I don't have an opinion. Again, going back to 100% renewables, we can't get there. We just can't just now. I don't think that in practice anybody would disagree with having free energy that doesn't pollute, and I think in practice everybody would love that goal. It's how do we get there? Can we afford it? Going back to the rich and the poor, how do we do that? There's been a search, so that's on the pipeline and the keep it in the ground movement, which again, I really don't have an opinion other than, each has their, I don't agree with that approach. I think if we have resources, we need to use them, but we need to use them wisely. And if it can help reaching our goals, then so be it. On the search of gas bill, that I think it was a little different reasons. I think it was in the 2000s, it was the IPPs started building natural gas power plants, and lately it's the only thing that really makes sense, as you need to replace your fleet and you start needing generation options. They were not going to, the industry wasn't going to build any coal. They weren't going to build any nuclear, or was wise not to. Given what we saw. Renewables were not only, making sense, gas prices were dirt cheap. So some of that increase and boom in new gas plants, I think that's where it comes from. It's the only logical technology or source right now to generate electricity if you really need to do something, going back to cost effectiveness. If you need power, that's what you're going to do. It does have risks as well, right?
Can I just offer one anecdote on this question? I was talking to somebody recently at a consulting firm that's doing business with utilities, gas and electric utilities, and they told me that they really see in their clients a real change. This echoes your comment, that these utilities, both gas and electric utilities, are really feeling this sort of decarbonization pressure. Right, and they're really thinking longer term and factoring this into their business decisions longer term. And one comment that he made was in the aftermath of that San Bruno explosion in California 8-9 years ago, the immediate response was, what went wrong and how do we regulate this better? When the explosion happened in Massachusetts a few weeks ago, the immediate response among some of the utilities that he's hearing and others in the community is not how to regulate it better, but maybe we should shut it down and look for alternatives. So that what's really informing the utility thinking is this entire concept, theme, push, promotion, whatever you want to call it, towards decarbonization, and how that's affecting a lot of business planning. And I think that does echo your comment about utilities that you represent, sort of thinking in that mode, because they see the handwriting on the wall, whether or not there's an overarching federal climate policy, that they just see the handwriting on the wall longer term, and that's the way things are moving. It's economically makes sense to deploy more gas and renewables now, but longer term, it's this decarbonization that's informing the long-term planning.
Hi, Catherine Thompson. I work with Zipcar, and I'm a master's student at George Washington in Sustainable Urban Planning. Going back to the renewable energy affordability, I'm wondering how can we create that without waiting for the technology to be cheaper if there aren't any subsidies to target lower income individuals to use renewable energy?
I'm not a technologist, so I really don't know how you get there. Scale, R&D, what are the elements of, luck? I'm not against subsidies necessarily. I think there might be moments where you need them, but again, going back, you need to be very clear what you're doing. If you already have I don't know. Is there anything that solar can do that wind can't? I don't know. Again, that's, again, I don't have the answer to that. I'm not trying to be coy here. I honestly don't have the answer. But that's part of, when we're talking about subsidies, whether they make sense or not, is what are we trying to subsidize? What are we trying to get to? Back to the question, could we have a carbon tax or something that tackles the problem? Is that are we trying to create a market for technology and give money to Elon Musk? Or are we trying to decarbonize the economy?
He needs it
And-
now.
Right, and maybe, exactly. So what is the actual goal, right? But again, maybe the goal is to create new technology, and I get that argument as well. You get new technologies, and then the more, flowers bloom, and then blah, 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 blah. But I don't know, can
there
talk
is-
about it over drinks.
Maybe you could comment on this, though. There is one business model through community solar, where those that don't have access to or the ability to put rooftop solar panels, there are utilities and others offering programs where on a subscription basis you can buy into the output of a community solar array. And that's one way to reach a broader residential profile, including lower income consumers. I know this is not one of your members, but Austin Energy, which is a muni, has a community solar program where there is a carve-out for lower income consumers. Specifically for that community array. There's a lower price offer for lower income consumers, and there's an established cutoff for that. So, and there are a few other examples of utility programs to try to reach lower income consumers.
Absolutely. No, they're a good, community solar is a good solution, I should say, to the residential solar. Not only helps that way, the people that can't put it on their houses, but you can also put them strategically along the grid where it actually helps and it reduces the cost of integrating and actually can help, so you actually, create value for yourself and your system as a customer. So no, that's definitely a fantastic solution that I know utilities have exploited quite a bit. It's a little bit different from subsidies, but yeah, no, it's definitely a way in which you can incent the technology in a way that helps customers on the grid, definitely.
My name's Matthew. I'm a second-year student here. I was kind of curious to know what you think over the long term. Do you see solar eventually overtaking wind power on a levelized cost basis? And if so, how long would you say the time frame is like for that?
Again, I'm not a technologist. I don't know. Probably. That's what most people say. I trust the experts. I don't know, overtake and go beyond, but wind is pretty cheap. And again, those capacity factors in those massive wind turbines that GE is putting together, it's going to be hard to beat, but maybe match. I think solar has other advantages. It can be small, it can be distributed, all those little things that people like. I think solar has a very bright future, pun not intended.
No pun intended.
Very bright future, but it has maybe not as, it might not, so one thing is having a very bright future, another one is having solving all the problems we think it might solve, right? And going back to, it will need storage. We will need those systems, solar plus storage, to be competitive, and all those things. I think, economics bias, I think things need to make economic sense to be adopted in a sustainable way. Some things, if the economics don't make sense, they will be there for 2, 3, 5 years, and then no. But I think so. I think experts say that they do. There's a lot of work to be done on soft costs and balance of system and all the other things that are not the panels themselves. But I'm confident. I hope we'll get there. And if not, there's wind.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a first-year student at SAIS, and I just have a quick question, only because I'm from the state of Louisiana, where there's barely anything. If I don't have my glasses on, but it looks like nothing.
Yeah.
Do you? I don't know if you know why, or would have an inference as to why, whether it's lack of investment or like more policy-based as to why it's lacking.
I'm gonna
Before you answer
venture.
that, we should say that students should be able to figure this out and make the connections.
Okay.
You should be able to offer
I'm not
your
in that
your
class.
view. Now that what you've heard here, you should be able to offer your view. But anyway, go ahead.
What are the 3 options you think that could make?
Right.
I have no idea. From the top of my head, I'm going to play student here and offer one option, which is, I'm assuming that the median salary or in Louisiana is not very high. So there's probably a lot of issues of cost effectiveness when it comes to electricity production, I'm assuming. Any of these things do cost money, and rates do go up. Even if the sun is free and the wind is free, integrating them and building them does cost money, and rates do tend to go up. So I'm assuming regulators in Louisiana are not very eager to increase rates in general. That could be, I don't know, but I'm guessing that could be an option or one idea. I know that in New Orleans, for instance, there was a company, though, that took advantage of, as bad as Katrina was, there was a lot of new build and a lot of new reconstruction that happened right after, so there was a whole lot of new houses with brand-new roofs, which were perfect for new solar panels that couldn't have happened before because the roofs were just not structural sound enough to have a rooftop solar system. So they went into New Orleans and they talked to, you know, whoever they had to, the commission, regulatory folks and everything, and, you know, created a program for the lower income folks with new houses. And they started putting rooftop solar panels like there's no tomorrow. So there's been some private initiatives that I think are phenomenal, but I'm going back to my original comment, each state, each region has its own particular circumstances. Low income is a tricky one. Or not low income necessarily, but trying to keep rates low and affordable. It's a tricky one, and maybe, I don't know, maybe they have excess power. Again, I don't know the circumstances, but it's not, you have to really want it to introduce some of these things. Because the same companies that are in Louisiana, they are in other areas, and they do have renewables. So I'm assuming it's not the utility that doesn't want to, but there's something about the regulatory system that is not conducive to deploying renewables.
Up in the front here first.
Somebody in the back had to.
Well,
Okay.
Do the
we
second
can't
one.
get to both.
No, right here, and we'll do the back.
Just anecdotal evidence, since you mentioned Louisiana, we had our program review last week. I just came back from it, and I ran into a lady from a utility in New Orleans, and we chatted, and we said, well, why don't we do something? And if everything goes well, we're going to have a solar plus storage project.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay.
Thanks very much for an incredible presentation. I have come in with no knowledge. I said I was a layman. Lauren Hershey, I'm not related to that Hershey up front. We're often asked that question. I want to ask the flip side of Louisiana, which is North Carolina. What accounts for what they accomplished there? What was the inflection point? Was it the governor, the legislature, special interest on the private side, or Sierra Club? Can you illuminate for us? And that pun is intended.
I'm going to venture an answer. I don't know that I have it 100% right. A world in which regulators come up with a solution and give it to the utility is never as good as a world where the utility comes up with a plan and presents it to regulators. I think that's what happened. They preempted a policy that was more likely going to happen than not. And they decided, if I am the one, these are the goals of the state, these are the goals of the regulators. If I am the one proposing the solution and participating in the solution, I will control the solution. So that, all that solar is Duke owned for the most part, and or Duke operated, as opposed to other states.
Approximately 5 years.
No. Duke, I mean, like North Carolina, no, 2 years?
2 years.
Yeah, tops, if not less, yeah. It's very recent. I mean, everything in solar has been, yeah.
I think just
Very quickly.
relatively anecdotally, a lot of customer demand.
Yeah.
And Duke operates in a regulated environment there, but Duke also has an unregulated subsidiary that does renewable. So my guessing here has a mentality where they're looking to meet customer demand, and they have business that deals in renewables. They are a big renewable developer as well.
Yeah, they're very, so Lynn Good, the CEO of Duke, is now EI's chairman, and her theme is customer centricity. She's very focused, and she's having the whole EI community focused on customer centricity, so you're absolutely right. That is probably part of it, too.
And watch Georgia. The same thing is going on in Georgia with Southern Company.
I'm going to suggest we close at this point. We do have a little reception for those who could stay on and have a glass of wine. But please join me in thanking our panelists here.
Thank you all.